Right now, you're warm. Maybe you don't even notice it. Your thermostat is holding your living room at a steady 70 degrees, your blanket is pulled up to your chin, and somewhere in the walls around you, a furnace is quietly doing the one job that used to require your entire species' survival instincts just to accomplish. You can walk to a fridge and eat food that grew on the other side of the planet. You can flip a switch and light up the dark. Winter for you is an inconvenience. A reason to wear a jacket. A season you complain about on your way from a heated car to a heated building. Now strip all of that away. Imagine the temperature outside has been below freezing for 4 straight months. There's no roof over your head that wasn't built by your own hands from mud, bone, and animal hide. There's no stored food except what you managed to dry, smoke, or bury before the world turned white. The sun sets at 4 in the afternoon and doesn't return until nearly 8 the next morning. And in that darkness, every sound outside your shelter could be the wind, or it could be something with teeth. For tens of thousands of years, this wasn't a thought experiment. This was Tuesday. This was every winter, every year, for every person you're descended from. So the question is simple. For hundreds of thousands of years, with no heated homes, no thermal jackets, no supermarkets, and no medicine, how did human beings survive some of the deadliest winters our planet has ever produced, and not just survive them, but come out the other side smart enough, strong enough, and connected enough to build everything we have today? Let's start with the thing you'd think would kill them first, the cold itself. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Human beings are, biologically speaking, a tropical animal. We don't have thick fur, we don't hibernate, we don't have blubber like a seal. Compared to almost every other mammal that lived through an ice age, we are catastrophically underprepared for cold. A wolf can survive at -40 degrees Fahrenheit with nothing but the coat it was born with. Human dropped into the same conditions naked would experience hypothermia within roughly 10 to 20 minutes and death shortly after. And yet somehow this fragile, hairless tropical primate didn't just survive the ice age, it thrived through several of them, spreading across some of the coldest, harshest environments Europe and Asia have ever produced. The reason isn't biology, it's ingenuity. Humans didn't out-evolve the cold, they outthought it. The first weapon your ancestors used against winter wasn't a weapon at all, it was fire, and it changed everything about what was possible. Archaeologists have found strong evidence of controlled fire use at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa dating back roughly 1 million years, and by the time we reach sites in Europe from around 400,000 years ago, fire wasn't occasional, it was central to daily life. Think about what that actually means. Fire didn't just provide warmth, it pushed back the night, extending the useful hours of the day well past sunset. It changed the food humans could digest, since cooked meat and roots deliver dramatically more usable calories than raw ones, a discovery that some researchers, including primatologist Richard Wrangham, argue was one of the single biggest turning points in human evolution. Fire kept predators at a distance, since almost nothing that hunts in the dark wants to walk toward flame. And fire did something else, something easy to overlook. It gave people a reason to sit still together in a circle facing the same glowing center for hours at a time. Here's the part nobody talks about: that circle, that simple act of gathering around a shared flame in the freezing dark, may be one of the oldest and most important social technologies our species ever developed. It's where language sharpened. It's where stories were first told. Winter, in a strange way, may have built human culture as much as it threatened human survival. But fire alone doesn't keep you alive. You need somewhere to burn it that isn't just open sky. This is where shelter comes in, and the shelters your ancestors built during the coldest stretches of the Ice Age are honestly stunning feats of engineering, especially considering the tools available. At a site called Mezhyrich in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of dwellings built roughly 15,000 years ago, constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones, jaws stacked like bricks, tusks curved into doorframes, skulls used as structural anchors. The whole thing likely covered in hides and packed with turf and snow for insulation. Building a structure like that meant coordinating the labor of dozens of people, planning the layout in advance, and possessing a working knowledge of which bones could bear weight and which couldn't. This wasn't improvisation. This was architecture. Further south and earlier in time, Neanderthal groups at sites like Moldova in Ukraine were building mammoth bone shelters as far back as roughly 44,000 years ago, meaning this wasn't even a uniquely modern human trick. An entire different species of human was solving the same brutal problem with the same brutal material thousands of years before we were the only ones left doing it. Think about that for a second. The animal that could kill you, a woolly mammoth weighing up to 6 tons, became, after death, the very thing that kept you alive through the winter that animals' absence made deadly. Nothing about that relationship was simple, and nothing about it was accidental. Shelter and fire solved where you'd survive winter, But they didn't solve what you'd wear while you did it, and clothing turns out to be one of the most underrated survival technologies in human history. Here's what nobody tells you about ancient clothing. It wasn't just about staying warm. Cold weather clothing is arguably one of the primary reasons humans were able to migrate out of Africa and into freezing northern latitudes at all. Genetic studies on human body lice, which live specifically in clothing rather than on skin or in hair, have allowed researchers to estimate that humans began wearing regular clothing somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, a genetic clock hidden inside a parasite, quietly recording one of the most important inventions our species ever made. And the clothing itself wasn't crude. At the site of Sungir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found burials containing thousands of ivory beads arranged in patterns that mirror where fitted tailored clothing would have been sewn, suggesting close-fitting garments, not draped animal skins thrown over the shoulder. Bone needles with eyed holes, found at sites like Denisova Cave in Siberia dating back around 50,000 years. Tell the same story. Someone was sewing multiple layers of hide together into fitted shapes, the same basic principle behind the layered thermal clothing designed for Arctic expeditions today. This detail matters more than it seems. A draped animal skin traps some warmth. A fitted layered sewn garment with an insulating inner layer and a windproof outer layer can be the difference between surviving -30 degrees and not. Your ancestors weren't just wrapping themselves in whatever they could find. They were engineering thermal systems, one bone needle stitch at a time in near total darkness by firelight, using tools they'd carved from the very animals whose hides they were sewing. Fire, shelter, and clothing solved the temperature problem. But cold wasn't the only killer stalking an ice age winter. Starvation was arguably worse, and it demanded a completely different kind of intelligence. Picture it from your ancestors' perspective. Summer and autumn were the seasons of abundance: berries, roots, migrating herds, fish running upstream. Winter was the season everything disappeared. The plants died back. Many animals migrated away or became far harder to track through snow. The sun offered fewer hours of hunting light each day. If you hadn't prepared, winter simply killed you through slow starvation, and this is precisely why food preservation became one of the most sophisticated technologies of the Ice Age toolkit. Drying meat into what we'd now recognize as jerky. Smoking fish over low fires for days at a time. At sites in Siberia and northern Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberate pit storage, holes dug into permafrost that functioned essentially as natural freezers, keeping meat preserved for months in ground that never fully thawed. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. Your ancestors had discovered refrigeration using nothing but a hole in frozen ground, tens of thousands of years before the word refrigerator existed in any language. Fat mattered just as much as meat, and this is a detail modern audiences almost always miss. In cold climates, fat isn't a luxury, it's the most calorically dense fuel available, and hunting groups specifically targeted fatty animals like mammoths, bison, and reindeer during autumn, when the animals themselves had fattened up for their own winter survival. There's a grim, practical logic to it. The animals' preparation for winter became the humans' preparation for winter, one link in a food chain where every calorie had to be accounted for months in advance. Miscalculate and there was no backup plan. No grocery store 2 miles away. Just the slow, brutal arithmetic of calories stored against calories needed, playing out over 4 freezing months with zero margin for error. Surviving the physical demands of winter, though, was only half the battle. The other half was mental, and this is the part modern audiences tend to underestimate the most. Imagine 4 months of darkness, cramped shelters, limited food, and constant low-grade danger. No phones, no books, no entertainment beyond what other humans could provide. Why didn't ancient humans go insane? The honest answer is, some almost certainly did. But the overwhelming evidence suggests something remarkable happened instead. Winter became one of the primary drivers of human social and cultural development. With hunting and gathering severely limited, the long dark months freed up time that had to go somewhere, and archaeological evidence suggests it went into art, storytelling, music, and deepening social bonds. The cave paintings at Chauvet Cave in France, dated to roughly 36,000 years ago, and the ivory carvings and bone flutes found at sites like Hohlfels in Germany, dated to around 40,000 years ago, weren't created during the frantic activity of summer hunting season. Many researchers believe this kind of symbolic, creative work flourished specifically during the long confined winters, when groups were stuck together in shelters with time, firelight, and each other. Here's the reframe: winter didn't just threaten to break the human mind, it may have built it. The forced togetherness, the shared fire, the long nights that demanded conversation instead of silence, these conditions rewarded exactly the traits that define us as a species: cooperation, storytelling, empathy, planning for a future you couldn't yet see. A group that fractured under winter's pressure died. A group that pulled closer together, that shared food even when it meant less for yourself, that told stories to keep spirits up through the darkest months. That group survived and passed that same instinct for connection down to you. Zoom out far enough, and Ice Age winters weren't simply obstacles your ancestors overcame. They were a filter, a multi-100,000-year-long stress test, run over and over across dozens of generations, that selected specifically for cooperation, ingenuity, and the ability to plan months into an uncertain future. Every skill your ancestors used to survive winter, building complex shelters together, sharing preserved food fairly, sewing warmth into clothing, sitting in a circle telling each other the stories that made the dark feel smaller, required something that most animals never had to develop: a level of social trust and collective imagination powerful enough to hold a group together through months where the world seemed actively trying to end them. And it wasn't guaranteed. Entire Neanderthal populations, remarkably resilient and resourceful in their own right, appear to have struggled and eventually vanished as climate conditions shifted dramatically toward the end of the last ice age. Homo sapiens groups in many regions made it through not because they were physically stronger, but because their social networks, their trade routes for exchanging materials and information across long distances, and their capacity for flexible, cooperative problem-solving gave them more ways to adapt when any single strategy failed. Winter didn't just test bodies, it tested societies. And the societies that valued sharing over hoarding, cooperation over isolation, and long-term planning over short-term thinking were the ones whose descendants are reading this sentence right now. So think back to where we started: you, warm, comfortable, barely registering the effort it takes to survive a modern winter. That comfort isn't nothing. It's not something to feel guilty about, but it's worth remembering every once in a while exactly what it cost to get here. Winter came at your ancestors with 4 weapons at once: cold that could kill in minutes, darkness that stole half of every day, hunger that crept in slowly and mercilessly, and isolation that could unravel a group from the inside out. And piece by piece, generation by generation, your ancestors answered every single one. They answered the cold with fire and fitted sewn clothing. They answered the darkness with shelters engineered from the bones of the very giants that once threatened them. They answered the hunger with preserved meat, buried in frozen ground like nature's own freezer, and with the hard-won knowledge of exactly which animals to hunt and when. And they answered the isolation with something even more powerful than any physical technology: with art scratched onto cave walls by firelight, with music played on flutes carved from bird bone, with stories told in the dark that turned strangers into family and fear into resolve. None of that was inevitable. At almost any point across hundreds of thousands of years, in any one of thousands of small groups scattered across a freezing world, it could have gone the other way. It didn't, only because enough of your ancestors in enough winters chose each other over giving up. The next time you pull a blanket up in a warm room and barely think about it, remember what that blanket represents: 100,000 winters of people who refused to let the cold win, who turned fire and bone and thread and story into a chain unbroken enough to reach you. You are not just warm tonight, you are the proof that they made it.